When my daughter-in-law laughed at my old dress in front of everyone, she thought she was mocking a poor old woman. She did not know the gown she insulted was the reason she even had a brand to her name. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin, tell me in the comments which city you are listening from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me take you into mine. My name is Eleanor. I am 68 years old, a retired seamstress. Or at least, that is what people believe. I live quietly in a small town outside Chicago, surrounded by the smell of bread, the hum of an old sewing machine, and memories that refuse to fade. For years, I have stayed out of the noise of the world until last night. It was my son's anniversary dinner. The kind of evening where crystal glassware pretends to be kindness and chandeliers try to pass for warmth. I wore a deep sapphire dress that I had kept for decades. It was not new and it was not loud. It was mine. I had stitched some of its seams with my own hands years ago, when life felt like a small room with a very large dream. My daughter-in-law, Tessa, looked me up and down with a bright, easy smile. So vintage tonight, Eleanor. That is, intentional? Her friends laughed the way people do when they want their laughter to sting more than it sounds. I answered softly, "Some things never go out of style." She tipped her head. Of course. Some of us just evolve faster than others. The people near her pretended to sip and to smile. My son looked at his plate. I folded my napkin and placed it back on my lap because my hands had started to tremble, and I did not want to give her the satisfaction of seeing it. I told myself to breathe. I reminded myself of a lesson I learned a long time ago. When a person's identity is stitched from labels, they will always try to unthread yours. I tasted the bitterness on my tongue and let it dissolve. I was not angry. I was alert. Across the room, I noticed Margaret, my old assistant from another lifetime, watching me with quiet eyes. She raised her glass an inch in a gesture only I would read. It said, "You are still you." I gave the slightest nod. Outsiders thought I was a retired seamstress who loved old fabrics and quiet mornings. They were not wrong. They were just not complete. Dessert arrived. Tessa stood to toast, a polished smile on her face. To family, to success, and to the future, and to my dear mother-in-law, whose vintage taste always reminds us where fashion used to be. The laughter returned, practiced and safe. I looked at the silver tines of my fork and saw my reflection fractured into 4 neat lines. It made me smile for a reason no one there would understand. When people say, "It was just a dress," they are usually telling you they do not understand anything about your life. This dress had survived rooms that I barely survived. It had walked with me through a winter where I sold patterns to pay rent, through a summer where I learned how to draft a bodice with nothing but chalk and faith. I could still feel the weight of my husband's hand on my shoulder the first time I wore it. He had said, "When the world forgets your worth, wear something that remembers." I think that was the moment I decided to keep remembering, even when it hurt. After the toast, Tessa came to me with the kind of sweetness that is more blade than balm. "I hope you enjoyed yourself tonight." I said, "Yes, dear, it was a beautiful arrangement." She glanced at the dress again. "We should find you something more current. I could talk to the brands team." I almost laughed. "You could," I said, "but I suspect they already know me." Her smile faltered for a heartbeat. She did not understand why. That was all right. Understanding was not a requirement for consequence. On the way home, the city lights were small coins scattered across the windshield. I pressed 2 fingers to the seam at my waist and felt the tiny hand stitch I once placed where a machine could not reach. There is a special kind of strength in work that no one applauds because no one sees it. That night, I did not need applause. I needed a needle. I brewed tea, turned on the old lamp in my sewing room, and opened the cedar chest I had promised myself I would never open again unless silence became a lie. The documents lay where I left them years ago. The trust, the patents, the voting rights, the kind of paper that looks like paper until it moves markets. Beneath them was a small envelope sealed with a gold crest. I traced the emblem with my thumb and felt the past breathe. People in that glittering room believed they were laughing at an old woman in a faded dress. They were really laughing at a mirror they did not recognize. I folded the papers back into the chest and pulled fabric onto the table, the habit of my hands calming the noise inside me. I threaded the needle. I stitched with the quiet rhythm of a woman who has nothing to prove and everything to remember. By the time the sky began to pale, I had a plan. Nothing theatrical, nothing cruel. Precision is louder than spectacle when you use it correctly. I would not announce anything. I would not argue. I would simply stand where I was supposed to stand, and the room would remember what it had chosen to forget. In the morning, I called Margaret. She answered before the second ring. "Yes," she said without a hello, as if she had been waiting for this day as long as I had. "It is time," I replied. "Please arrange the files and send a polite note to the board that I will attend the gala." She exhaled, a sound like relief. "They still think you sold everything." "They can think whatever is comfortable," I said. "Comfort is not the same as truth." I made breakfast and watered the plants. The kettle clicked. The house was quiet in the way old houses are quiet, which is to say they are full of the sounds of things settling into their rightful places. My son called to ask if I slept well. I said yes. He asked if Tessa's toast had bothered me. I said no. Both things were true in the ways that mattered. He told me the brand had invited Tessa to present a capsule collection at the annual gala. "They want her as the new face of elegance," he said, pride and uncertainty fighting in his voice. "Elegance has a face," I answered gently. "It also has a spine." After the call, I stood at the mirror and lifted the sapphire dress from its hanger. I pressed the side seam flat and checked the hem, the way I always do, the way a musician tunes before playing the first note. I thought of the women who bought my earliest gowns on layaway because they had weddings to attend and dreams to protect. I remembered fixing a hem for a stranger in a bathroom because she was crying and I had a needle. These are the things that make a brand a life instead of a label. Tessa believed that the right invitation could make her important. I believed that showing up with the truth could make her careful. Belief is a choice. So is care. I placed the dress back on the hanger and opened the cedar chest one more time. Beneath the folders was a thin leather folio tied with a ribbon that time had faded. My husband had left it for me the year the board tried to push me out because I would not approve a campaign that mocked the very women who kept us alive. I untied the ribbon and read the first line in his steady handwriting. "If you are opening this, it means someone has mistaken your silence for absence. Go where you are seen and bring the papers that remember you." I closed the folio with a steady hand. There is a certain calm that arrives when humiliation fails to move you. It is not numbness, it is clarity. I dressed, called a car, and sent a message to Margaret with one sentence. "Please confirm my attendance for Saturday." She replied with a single word, "Confirmed." I stepped outside. The morning air was cool and clean. I locked the door and turned the key the way I always have. A small ritual that tells a home to keep your secrets while you go make new ones. I did not look back. I did not have to. Some places sit inside you even when you are nowhere near their walls. People thought last night ended with a toast and a laugh. For me, it ended with a needle and a decision. And when Saturday came, I would not raise my voice. I would raise my name. It began long before Tessa ever learned how to pronounce the word couture. I was 22 in a rented basement where the ceiling was low and the landlord was loud. I ironed on a board that wobbled and drafted patterns on butcher paper I bought with coins. I stitched for brides who paid in 3 installments and for mothers who wanted one good dress that would carry them through baptisms and funerals. I learned the strength of a backstitch and the danger of a bargain. I learned that hands can pray without folding when they are busy making something that refuses to fall apart. Thomas met me at a street market where I was hemming a skirt on my lap for a woman who could not afford to wait. He held the fabric for me while I worked and did not speak until I tied the thread. "It looks like it was always meant to be this length," he said. I smiled because he had noticed the thing I cared about most, not the seam itself, but the illusion that the garment had never been anything else. We married in a dress I cut from a remnant and a suit he bought secondhand and tailored himself. We built a life in neat rows of effort. Maison Eileen began 2 years later with a borrowed machine and a name that felt like a promise. People imagine brands are born from brilliance. They are born from repetition. I sewed the same clean line until it became a signature, and then I protected it from people who wanted to make it cheaper, faster, louder. Thomas protected me from the things I did not see. I did not understand contracts. He did. I did not understand why a kind voice could hide a sharp clause. He did. When the first investor insisted on a campaign that mocked older women for wearing older clothing, I said no. When a board member suggested we cut the lining to save a few cents and boost margins, I said no again. It cost us growth, and it bought us respect. The right women found us. They told their daughters. The daughters told their friends. We grew anyway. The year the world decided that cruelty was fashionable, a group of men tried to force me into a sale that would have given them everything and given me a framed photograph of what used to be mine. Thomas drafted the trust that kept voting control in my hands. "You may not want to use it," he said, "but you will want to know it is there." He died before I learned how completely he had saved me from becoming a guest in my own house. I stepped away after the funeral and let silence carry me, because silence was the only thing that did not demand my performance. Years passed. The brand changed leadership twice. New people said new words about innovation. They added marble to the lobby and removed sleeves from the gowns. I watched from a distance and told myself they would remember the spine of the thing when the wind picked up. They did not. They began to reward the women who laughed at other women. They mistook glare for light. They hired faces instead of hands. A face can sell a season. A hand builds a lifetime. I stayed away until the night Tessa turned my dress into a joke. It was not her insult that woke me. It was the sound of the room agreeing. I know that sound. It is the sound of a tide turning in the wrong direction. When that sound grows, it does not stop at a dress. It comes for memory. It comes for mercy. In the days before the gala, I moved the way a seamstress moves, when the fabric is expensive and the deadline is real. I called Margaret and asked for the archive ledgers, the original patent records, the early buyer lists with handwritten notes in the margins. She arrived with boxes that smelled like dust and lavender. "I kept everything," she said, almost apologizing. "Do not apologize for keeping what remembers us," I answered. We sat at my kitchen table and sorted the history into 3 strict piles: proof of origin, proof of control, proof of intent. I wrote each label in ink and underlined it once. Margaret laughed softly. "You have not changed." I smiled. "The hem is still where it has always been." My son noticed the shift without knowing what had shifted. He came by to bring me groceries and stood in the doorway looking at the boxes. "Are you moving?" he asked. "No," I said. "I am staying." He looked confused, and then nodded because he trusts my sentences when he does not understand them. He told me Tessa was preparing a speech for the gala. He told me she wanted me seated in the 3rd row because the first 2 rows would be for press and partners. I thanked him for the information and changed nothing in my face. He kissed my forehead and left with questions he did not ask. Later that night, I opened the leather folio again and read Thomas's letter from start to finish without stopping. It was not long. He did not waste words when he could use weight. The line that held me was the one where he wrote, If they mock the woman you became by doing the work, remind them that the work is what lets them mock at all. Some sentences arrive like keys. I folded the letter and placed it beside the documents that would say the same thing in a language boards cannot ignore. I called the foundation director and asked for a list of applicants who had been declined for lack of connections rather than lack of talent. She emailed 20 names within an hour. I read the portfolios and circled 6. They were not polished. They were honest. I called the production head and told her to prepare space at the atelier for 6 additional apprentices beginning next month. She asked about budget. I said, use the money we set aside for a campaign that tells older women they are out of style. She laughed, then realized I was not joking, then said, yes, Mrs. Grace, in a voice that remembered. The morning before the gala, I walked to the old shop on Belmont and pressed my palm to the window. The room had changed tenants 4 times since I left. It is a repair shop now. A man fixing a radio looked up and gave me a nod. I returned without claiming any history he did not ask to hear. I do not need people to know I began there. I only need to remember that I did. On my way home, I passed a boutique window with Tessa's face printed larger than the dress she wore. The caption said, "The new face of elegance." I stood on the sidewalk and considered the statement. Elegance does not need a new face. It needs an old truth. It is a difficult truth to sell because it cannot be photographed. It can only be felt when a woman stops worrying about whether she looks expensive and starts feeling like she looks like herself. That is why marketing keeps trying to rename it. It cannot be owned, so they keep printing it bigger. I prepared for the gala by doing 3 very ordinary things. I pressed the hem of the sapphire dress with a warm iron and a cloth between to protect the fabric's memory. I polished the small mother-of-pearl buttons my husband once replaced for me when I was too tired to see the needle's eye. And I cooked lentils. When life requires clarity, simple food is a promise you can keep. I ate slowly at the kitchen table and listened to the kettle hum. The house settled. My hands stopped trembling. Resolve is a quiet guest. It does not knock. It just sits down and waits for you to notice it is there. In the afternoon, Margaret called to say the seating chart had been finalized, and I was listed among heritage guests. I smiled at the phrase. Heritage is what they call you when they want your story in the brochure and your voice out of the room. Thank you, I told her. Please do not correct it. She paused. Are you sure? Yes, I said. People behave honestly around what they underestimate. As sunset touched the windows, I took out a small velvet pouch from the back of the cedar chest. Inside was my husband's watch. The back carried an engraving I had not seen the year it was given to me because I had cried too hard to read. I read it now, for the woman whose time belongs to no one. I fastened it around my wrist, not as jewelry, but as instruction. The car arrived. I stood at the doorway and looked once around the room, the chair by the lamp, the folded quilt on the armrest, the patterned chalk on the sewing table that never really disappears no matter how well you wipe it. Home is a place that forgives your pauses. I turned the key and stepped into the evening air that smelled like rain and warm stone. People imagine confrontations happen like thunder. The most effective ones do not raise their voices. They adjust the lighting. They put the original in front of the copy and let the eye do its work. On the ride to the hotel, I closed my eyes and walked through the order of things the way I walk through the order of stitches. Begin with a gentle line. Anchor the corners. Do not tug when patience will do. Cut clean. Finish the inside as carefully as the outside. Turn, press, wear. I did not rehearse what I would say because I did not need to say much. Paper would speak for me. Presence would do the rest. The driver asked if I wanted music. I asked for silence. It is the rarest luxury in a city that believes noise equals life. By the time the hotel lights rose ahead like a crown, everything that needed to be in my hands was in my hands. The dress remembered. The papers remembered. I remembered. And somewhere inside that building, a young woman was practicing a smile in a mirror she mistook for a future. I did not hate her. Hate is a heavy bag for a long walk. I carried something lighter. I carried proof. When the car stopped, I checked the button at my wrist and felt the watch tick against my pulse, like a small agreement. I stepped out, smoothed the dress, and lifted my chin the way my husband once told me to do when the wind tried to take more than my breath. I did not come to be seen. I came so that what should be seen would have no choice. The car slowed before the hotel's awning. Cameras flared like lightning that had lost its purpose. I stepped out and walked through the lobby without pausing long enough for a photograph. The marble echoed with heels that remembered their rhythm. The air smelled of lilies and perfume, meant to prove wealth. I handed my coat to an attendant who was too young to know my face and kind enough not to pretend he did. Inside the ballroom, the lights were already too bright. The screen behind the stage showed the words Maison Hélène Annual Gala in gold that did not belong to itself. I found my name on a card in the third row, just as Tessa had planned. The chairs in front of me were reserved for journalists and board members. Margaret sat 2 seats away, her eyes calm and unreadable. She gave the smallest nod when our gazes met. It meant everything was in place. Tessa stood near the stage, surrounded by cameras. She wore a white gown with structured shoulders, the sort of dress that tried to imitate authority. People leaned in close to tell her she was radiant. She believed them. I watched her glance toward me twice. The second time, she smiled as if the sight of me confirmed her victory. I did not return the smile. When the music softened and the host called her name, she walked to the microphone with perfect posture. "Good evening," she began. "Tonight is about honoring where we come from and where we are going. Maison Hélène has always stood for grace, innovation, and timeless beauty." The words were carefully memorized. I recognized them because I had written their first version 30 years ago. She continued, "Our brand is evolving. We are proud to announce a new chapter, one that celebrates the future of fashion and the women who inspire it." Applause filled the room. The lights shifted to show the first model stepping onto the runway in a metallic gown that glared under the chandeliers. It was a spectacle of money, not of craft. The seams were careless. The lines were borrowed. I could hear Thomas's voice in my head. "When the shine blinds you, it usually means they ran out of substance." Halfway through the show, Tessa invited a group of executives to join her on stage. She raised her glass. "To the women who built this house," she said, "and to the ones who will make it shine brighter than ever." I stood then, slow enough for heads to turn. The sound of my chair scraping the floor silenced more people than her microphone. I walked toward the stage, each step measured and quiet. The photographers turned instinctively, sensing the story before knowing what it was. "Mrs. Grace," the host said uncertainly, "would you like to—" "Yes," I said. "I would." I climbed the short stairs and faced the crowd. "My name is Eleanor Grace. Some of you may not remember it. Some of you have been repeating it in the fine print of your contracts for years." A murmur spread through the audience. I reached into my small evening bag and took out the folder Margaret had given me earlier. I opened it carefully. This company began in a basement. The first patterns were cut on a kitchen table. The trust that holds its patents and voting rights was signed by my late husband and myself 31 years ago. These documents are still active. I handed one to the nearest executive, who began to read with a face that forgot how to smile. "I will not take your time," I continued. "Tonight is indeed about honoring where we come from and where we are going. I am simply here to correct the direction." Margaret joined me and set a second folder on the podium. "The board meeting to formalize the transfer of control back to Mrs. Grace will be held tomorrow morning," she said evenly. Tessa tried to laugh, but it cracked halfway. "This is absurd," she whispered. "You cannot just walk in and—" "I can," I said quietly, "because I never walked out." Gasps rolled through the room like slow thunder. Cameras clicked without knowing where to point. I looked at Tessa, not with anger, but with something colder. "When you mocked this dress," I said, touching the sleeve, "you were mocking the blueprint of everything you stand on. You called it old. It is older than you and stronger than your understanding of elegance." The silence after that was long enough to be permanent. I closed the folder, handed it back to Margaret, and stepped down. People began to stand, not to applaud, but because they did not know what else to do. Tessa remained on stage, frozen between disbelief and realization. The lights that had been meant for her followed me to the exit. In the hallway outside, I paused to breathe. The noise from the ballroom faded behind the door like water pulling back from shore. Margaret caught up, her voice low. "You did not raise your voice." "I did not need to," I said. "Paper speaks louder when the ink remembers." We walked together until the sound of cameras vanished entirely. I thanked her, kissed her cheek, and told her to rest. She asked, "What will you do now?" "Go home," I said. "The rest of them have work to do." The car was waiting. I sat in the back seat and watched the city drift by in reverse through the window. I thought of the seam lines that run along the inside of every gown, invisible to the eye but holding everything together. A brand, a family, a life. They are all held by seams, and when someone pulls too hard on a loose thread, the smartest thing you can do is remind them who stitched it first. That night, the story began to travel before I reached home. Social feeds turned the moment into myth. The founding designer returns. The dress that changed everything. I turned off the phone. I did not need to read what the world had decided to believe. I had seen enough to know that the truth was quieter. When I reached the house, the watch on my wrist ticked softly. I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. The air smelled of rain. Somewhere in the city, a young woman was learning the difference between ownership and display. I hoped she learned it well. I took a deep breath and whispered into the stillness. Let them remember the work, not the war. By the time I woke up, the city had already decided what it believed about last night. Headlines were everywhere. Some called me a legend. Some called me a storm. I made tea and did not turn on the television. I have learned that the truth is easier to carry when you do not let noise fasten itself to your clothes. My phone buzzed until it gave up. Margaret sent a single message. "Board at 10 Wowzer, you have the votes." I replied with 2 words. "Bring originals." Before I continue, tell me in the comments if you have ever kept quiet long enough that people mistook it for weakness. I want to know how you handled the moment when you finally spoke. The house felt different that morning, as if the walls had shifted an inch closer to the place where they belonged. I opened the cedar chest and lifted the folio with my husband's ribbon. I had read his letter many times, but the paper still carried a weight I could feel in my wrists. He had written for a future he would never see. I read the line that always steadies me. If they mistake your silence for absence, go where you are seen and bring the papers that remember you. I folded the letter and slid it into my bag beside the trust documents and the original patent filings. At 9:40, I walked into a lobby that had been designed to impress investors who confuse stone with assurance. The receptionist stood when she recognized me, though I do not think she understood why she stood. "Good morning, Mrs. Grace," she said. "The board is expecting you." I thanked her and took the stairs. Elevators pretend at arrival. Stairs tell the truth. Inside the boardroom, people rearranged their faces so quickly they forgot which one they had chosen. A few tried to smile. Most tried not to breathe too loudly. Margaret sat near the end with a legal pad and 3 neatly stacked folders. She did not smile. She did not need to. "Mrs. Grace," the chair began, "last night created attention. We would like to align on narrative." I placed the folio on the table. "We will align on facts first. Narratives can wait." I opened the trust documents and set them in the center where light could find them. These are original. This trust retains majority voting rights under my control. It was executed the year you were still buying fabric on credit from a vendor who carried you because he believed your word meant something. A few heads lowered. I continued. We will not reward cruelty. We will not sell shame as style. We will end any ambassador agreement that mistakes mockery for influence. A man at the far end cleared his throat. Our projections... I lifted a hand. Your projections confuse heat with light. We are a house, not a spark. Margaret slid a second folder across the table. Values update, she said. Already drafted. I nodded. Vote. Papers moved. Pens scratched. The chair stared at the trust and then at me, as if waiting for permission to remember what he once admired. All in favor, he said. Hands rose. Opposed. No one moved. Carried. He exhaled, and the room exhaled with him. I gathered the documents without haste. People mistake haste for power. Power is pace without apology. There will be a foundation line item, I said. 10% of net to scholarships for designers without doors. Cut the budget for campaigns that humiliate older women. Replace it with mentorship hours. If a partner resists, release them. We are not in the business of buying mirrors for people who refuse to look. Someone asked about the press. I said, write one paragraph. Maison Hélène returns to its original promise. Craft over noise, dignity over spectacle. No interviews, no victory lap. Let the work speak loudly and let us speak softly. When I stepped into the corridor, my phone lit again. Messages from editors who had once ignored my invitations now begged for quotes. I ignored them, not because I was ungrateful, but because attention is a fabric that frays when you tug it too soon. On the way out, I stopped in a small office where a junior designer sat pinning a muslin on a dress form. She looked up with the cautious eyes of someone used to being interrupted by people who want to be seen near effort without joining it. What is your name? I asked. Anna, she said, standing too quickly. Sit, I told her. Pin the side seam again. Do not be afraid to take out what you just did if it will make the next stitch truer. She nodded, and her hand steadied. That is the work, not the flashbulbs, not the flowers. That moment when a hand learns, it can correct itself without apology. Back at home, I finally opened the envelope I had ignored in the cedar chest. It was smaller than the folio and sealed with an old crest. Inside was a single card. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you refuse to let anyone take. My husband had tucked that line away from me, like a pin you keep on your hem for the day a thread tries to wander. By noon, the public story had started crawling across screens, clips of the gala, slowed and captioned by people who have never threaded a needle. Founder reclaims house. The dress that ended a dynasty of mockery. I made soup the way my mother taught me and let the kettle sing. I answered one call, Margaret again. The ambassadors have questions, she said. We will answer with guidelines, not gossip, I told her. Send them the values sheet. The ones who belong will stay. The ones who do not will free space for better. Before I go on, if you are still with me, tap like so I know you are here. It helps the story travel, and it tells me you want to hear how this ends. At 3 o'clock, I walked to the atelier on Belmont, not the headquarters, the room with the long windows and the ghosts who behave themselves. The keys still turned the way they always had. Dust lifted in soft sheets as I opened the door. Dress forms stood like patient listeners. The old cutting table had the same faint constellation of chalk marks. I placed the watch my husband gave me on the table and listened to it tick for a minute. It sounded like order returning. Margaret arrived with 6 folders, the apprentices I had circled. I took the liberty of calling them, she said. They cried. I smiled. Let them cry today. Tomorrow they will baste. We laid out bolts of practice muslin and boxes of pins. We set 2 machines on the table and oiled them until they purred. This is what a relaunch looks like when you are serious. Thread, oil, paper, hands. The doorbell rang and the first young woman stepped in, clutching a portfolio that sagged with effort. She looked around the room as if it might disappear. "I was told to come at 4, she said. "You were told correctly. You will begin by unpicking your best piece. Then you will make it better." She blinked and then laughed from somewhere honest. "Yes, Mrs. Grace." I told her to call me Eleanor and handed her a seam ripper. While she worked, I answered the only message from Tessa I intended to answer. It said, "You humiliated me." I read it twice. Then I wrote, "I corrected a mirror." I did not press send. I deleted it and wrote, "The foundation begins next month. If you wish to learn the difference between wearing a brand and building one, there will be a chair here at 8 a.m. for volunteers. The door will close at 8:05. I pressed send and put the phone face down. Sunlight slid along the floor in a thin ribbon. I pin-fit a bodice on a form and felt the old comfort in the space between thumb and forefinger, where fabric answers you back. The apprentice asked if she could keep the seam allowance wider, just in case. I said yes. Restraint is not fear when it is chosen. It is planning. By evening, the press had invented 3 versions of my motives and 2 endings to my marriage, none of which existed. I boiled more water and wrote a 1-paragraph statement for the website, exactly as promised. It read, "Maison Hélène returns to its original promise. We will create work that honors the women who wear it and the women who make it. We will partner with those who believe kindness is a luxury and dignity is a basic. Our house is open to talent, not cruelty." I sent it to Margaret with a full stop and nothing more. The next morning, portraits of me appeared on pages that once preferred younger faces. When people finally remember you, they try to make it look like they never forgot. I let them try. I had other tasks. I drafted a policy that banned any campaign line that used age as a punchline. I added a clause that required every collection to fund at least 1 apprenticeship cycle. I wrote, "If a design cannot survive in silence, it is not strong enough to survive a season." At noon, a courier delivered a slim package to my door. No return address. Inside was a photograph of my husband standing beside the first industrial machine we bought. On the back, in his hand, he had written, "You were always the point." I sat down and let myself cry for the first time since the gala, not because I was sad, but because relief has a way of leaving through your eyes. By late afternoon, I had something I wanted you to hear exactly as I wrote it. Because some of you will need words like these one day when someone tries to shrink you to fit their mirror. I wrote it on a card and taped it inside the cedar chest. When they mistake your quiet for emptiness, let the work arrive in your place. When they call your proof old, say thank you, because old is another word for tested. When they call your dress out, tell them the door is too. If you have listened this far, tell me in the comments one thing you refuse to let anyone take from you. I read every single one, even if I cannot reply to all of them, because your lines matter as much as mine. That night, I slept without dreaming. In the morning, I tied my hair with the ribbon from the folio and went back to the atelier before the street woke up. The apprentices arrived early, which is how I knew they were mine. We basted in silence for an hour. Then I told them the only rule that can hold a house: finish the inside like someone will turn it inside out. They nodded and sewed and did not look at their phones. And somewhere across town, a billboard company called to ask if we needed a larger image for the next campaign. I told them no. I told them we needed a smaller label inside the collar with a single line, "Made without mockery." They paused and said no one would see it. I said the right people would. This is how the morning after became the year after, not with a shout, with a stitch, not with a crown, with a watch that kept time I did not owe to anyone, not with revenge, with refusal. The morning the first reviews came out, I did not rush to read them. I brewed tea, opened the curtains, and let the light fill the room before giving the world permission to speak again. Fame has a way of arriving like a guest who does not knock, loud, eager and certain that the house was built for them. Margaret called before 8. "They are calling you a revolution," she said. "Or a relic?" I asked. "Both," she replied, "which means we did it right. If you have ever been underestimated long enough that success feels suspicious, tell me in the comments. I want to know how you handled it when people who ignored you started pretending they believed in you all along." I scrolled through the articles. One headline read, "The Return of Grace. Old Money Meets New Morals." Another, "Maison Helene's founder silences the industry without saying a word." They praised the craftsmanship, the quiet defiance, the choice to feature women of every age in the lookbook, but the piece that caught me most was buried near the end of an online column. It said, "She didn't fight fire with fire. She rebuilt the room where fire isn't needed." I closed the laptop. That line was enough. By midweek, orders had tripled. The ateliers buzzed again, not with panic, but with purpose. The apprentices moved with a confidence that made the fabric hum under their fingers. Every stitch felt like a line of apology to the art itself for what the industry had done to it. Tessa had not shown up at the atelier. I did not expect her to, not yet. But every time the door opened, a small part of me hoped it would be her. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted her to see what it looks like when someone builds instead of begs. That Friday, I hosted a silent showing. No music, no runway, just models walking through a sunlit hall lined with glass. The audience was small: journalists, longtime artisans, students who had written to us in trembling hope. They were asked not to clap, only to observe. When the first model stepped out wearing the rebuilt dress, the same design that had been mocked, I watched the room go still. The fabric was heavier now, richer, dyed in a deeper shade of emerald. The mockery had been stitched into strength. The finale was a coat made entirely from the offcuts of rejected materials: silk, wool, lace, linen, all the fragments others had deemed unusable. I called it inheritance. When the model turned under the light, the entire coat shimmered like forgiveness, learning to walk. After the show, a young critic approached me. She must have been in her 20s, nervous but sincere. "Mrs. Grace," she said, it didn't feel like fashion. It felt like remembering," I finished for her. She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes," I smiled. "Then we have done our work." That night, I returned home to a single envelope on the doorstep. Thick ivory paper sealed with wax. No name. I took it inside and stared at it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate. It began simply, "You do not know me, but you knew my mother." My heart paused. The letter went on. "My name is Elise. My mother was Margaret's assistant 20 years ago. She often spoke of you. The woman who ran the company like a compass, who made even silence sound like strategy. I am writing because I saw the show today. I was there, sitting near the back. I am one of the scholarship recipients from your new foundation. I didn't know you were the one funding it until they said your name after the final piece. My mother passed away 3 years ago, but she left me a note that I never understood until today. It said, 'When you meet a woman who builds her own name twice, listen.' Today, I listened. By the time I finished reading, I realized my hands were trembling. It was not sadness. It was the strange, quiet joy of being seen by someone who had no reason to know your pain, but understood it anyway. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the old ribbon from the gala dress. The two belonged together. One from a past that tried to break me, one from a future that was already learning from the cracks. The next morning, Margaret arrived with a folder full of press requests. Vogue wants a feature. Harper's wants a cover. A documentary crew is asking for behind-the-scenes access. "Tell them no," I said. She frowned. "No to all of them?" "Yes. Let them chase what they think is a comeback. We are not coming back. We are moving forward." Margaret smiled slowly. "You know, The more you refuse to speak, the louder your silence gets. I know, I said, sipping my tea. That is the point. Later that week, I visited the factory on the edge of the city, the one we almost lost during the buyout years. The workers stopped when they saw me, and for a moment the room filled with the sound of machines winding down. Keep sewing, I said, raising my voice over the hum. If I have to shout over silence, it means I did something wrong. They laughed softly and kept going. One of the seamstresses, an older woman with silver hair tied back in a bun, walked over holding a dress still pinned at the shoulders. "Mrs. Grace," she said, "we've been waiting for you to come back." I looked at her calloused hands, at the years of work they carried. "I never left," I said. "I was just letting the noise tire itself out." That evening, I met with the apprentices. They had finished their first collection, small, imperfect, but filled with heart. One of them, Anna, presented a simple linen dress. "It is not perfect," she said, "but it feels honest." That, I told her, is perfection. We decided to name the collection Threaded Truths. It would be released quietly without a launch party or celebrity endorsements, just photographs of the garments on real women, seamstresses, teachers, nurses, mothers, no filters, no slogans, just fabric, form, and light. When the campaign went live, the internet did something unexpected. It did not argue. It did not scream. It simply watched. The comments were filled with words I had not seen in years. Graceful, peaceful, needed. It was as if people had been waiting for permission to rest from the chaos. And then, just when I thought the storm had passed, another letter arrived. This one was typed, unsigned, but unmistakably from Tessa. "You were right," it began. "Mockery is easy. Building is not. I did not come to the atelier because I thought I had ruined my chance. But I watched the show, I saw the dress, and I realized you were never trying to destroy me. You were trying to teach me what it means to make something that lasts. I have started again, not as an influencer, as an apprentice. Thank you, even if you never answer." I read it twice. Then I smiled. I would not reply. Not yet. Some lessons grow best in quiet. That night I walked through the atelier one last time before locking up. The air smelled of thread and cedar and something new. Hope, maybe. I turned off the lights, and in the reflection of the glass door, I saw the faint outline of the old dress hanging in the corner, the one that had started it all. It no longer looked old. It looked eternal. If you are still with me, tell me this in the comments. Have you ever turned humiliation into strength? Have you ever built something so beautiful that the people who doubted you had to watch in silence? Because that is what this story was always about. Not revenge, not power, but reclamation of dignity, of voice, of time. When my daughter-in-law mocked my old dress, she did not know she was mocking her own reflection. She did not know she was looking at the woman who owned not just the dress, but the empire that would teach her what real luxury looks like. And sometimes, the finest revenge is not fire. It is grace stitched back together, thread by thread. Morning light spilled through the atelier windows like gold paint sliding across fabric. The apprentices were already at work. Soft chatter, the hum of machines, the rhythm of creation. I stood by the window, a cup of tea in hand, watching the life that had returned to this place. The world had calmed. The noise, the interviews, the opinions, all of it had quieted. What remained was the sound of thread pulling through cloth. Sometimes that is how real healing sounds, not like applause, but like continuity. A week later, Tessa came. She did not send an email or make an appointment. She simply appeared at the atelier door, her posture smaller than I remembered, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion that no makeup could hide. I nodded to Margaret, who hesitated, then let her in. Tessa stood in the center of the room, surrounded by half-finished dresses and rolls of muslin. the same place she once called outdated. I almost turned around, she said quietly. I didn't think you'd even look at me. I'm looking, I said. She held out a small envelope. I brought the share papers. I signed them over. It felt wrong holding something I didn't earn. I looked at the envelope but didn't take it. You earned something else by coming here. Sit. She sat, her eyes darting toward the apprentices, who pretended not to watch. When I mocked you, she said, her voice trembling, I thought I was proving I belonged. I thought confidence meant volume. I didn't realize how loud insecurity can be. I placed my tea down. We all learn at the cost of something. What matters is whether we waste the lesson. Her eyes filled. Can I work here? Work? I repeated. Yes, but not here. Not yet. She looked confused. You will start where I did, I said. At the factory. You will learn the difference between designing and deserving. You will cut, sew, and bleed on fabric until your hands remember humility. Only then will I call you back. She nodded slowly. I understand. No, I said softly. You don't. Not yet, but you will. When she left, Margaret came beside me. You could have refused her, she said. I did not rebuild all this to refuse redemption, I replied. But forgiveness should have calluses, not cushions. That evening, I walked alone through the old house, the one where Thomas and I started it all. The walls still smelled faintly of lavender and starch, and the old Singer machine sat in the corner like a memory that refused to fade. I sat at the desk and opened the drawer where I had kept everything: the trust papers, the sketches, and the letters. At the bottom was one I had never opened. It was dated a week before Thomas passed. The handwriting was weaker than usual, the ink faint. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, you have survived another storm. You always do. Remember this: wealth built on cruelty is a glass palace. It may glitter, but it breaks loud. Ours was built from thread and kindness. It will never shatter, only fray, and you will know how to mend it. Teach them not just to wear luxury, but to deserve it. And when the world forgets your name again, wear your oldest dress. That is where I'll be, stitched in the seams. I closed the letter, holding it against my chest until the shaking in my hands stopped. That night, I went back to the atelier. The city was asleep, but inside, the lamps glowed warm over the cutting tables. I took out the emerald dress from its stand, the one that had witnessed humiliation, rebellion, and rebirth. I pinned a note to the lining, small enough that only someone searching would find it. It said, "Mockery fades, craft remains, e.g." Then I hung it back where it belonged, at the entrance, facing the morning light. Weeks passed. The first collection from the apprentices sold out online without advertising. Customers said it felt different, real, honest, human. We started receiving letters from women who had stopped buying designer clothes years ago, saying they felt seen again. That was the point all along. And then, one morning, a photo arrived in my inbox. Tessa, hair tied back, standing in the factory, hands covered in chalk dust, smiling beside Anna and the seamstresses. No caption, no filters, just proof. I smiled back at the screen. Sometimes people do not need applause. They need permission to start over. Later, I returned to the same mansion where it all began, my son's house, where the mocking words were first spoken. The hall was quieter now. He greeted me with a long, uncertain hug. "She's changing," he said. "I didn't think she would, but she is." I touched his cheek. "We all do when we finally run out of excuses." He smiled. "She said you gave her another chance." "I gave her work," I corrected gently. "The chance is hers to make." We sat together for a while, watching the light fade. There were no apologies. None were needed. When I look back now, I realize revenge is noisy, but justice whispers. The world will always have people who measure worth by what shines, but the quiet strength of legacy, that is something you cannot buy, only build. If you've ever been mocked, underestimated, or told you're too old, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, because your story might be the next one I tell here. Make sure to subscribe for more stories like this, where silence turns into strength and every fall becomes a comeback. And remember, no matter who laughs today, grace always wins tomorrow.